We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Those were the words that launched the 19th Amendment. They come from the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in the year 1848. And of course, they were taken from the Declaration of Independence, except for the words "and women," which were added. Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Watson, and welcome to our Extreme History streaming lectures. I'm sitting here in my son's bedroom, Alexander Watson. He's the producer of this. Today's program is on a man, a mother, and a good boy, the story of the 19th Amendment. The story of the 19th Amendment begins in the year 1840 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Stanton was from New York. She was an abolitionist, remarkably well-read. Mott was from Massachusetts. She was also an abolitionist and a Quaker. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton had gotten married, and her husband asked what they wanted to do for the honeymoon. You gotta love her. She said, there's a international anti-slavery convention in Europe, and I want to go to it. So that's what they did for their honeymoon. They go all the way to Europe. Unfortunately, when Stanton arrived, she found out that women were not admitted. I mean, that is wrong on so many levels. So Stanton was not able to go in. She was out in the hallway stewing, and she runs into another woman, Lucretia Mott, who had the same idea, who went there and was not admitted either. So the two of them are talking about, when we go back to the U.S., we need to start a women's movement and get the right to vote and the right to do all these other things, along with continuing the fight to end slavery. During a break in the convention, one of the men that was attending, he comes out and he meets the two of them, finds out that they weren't admitted. He thinks it's fundamentally wrong that women can't attend either. They start talking and decide that the three of them are going to work together to launch the right to vote for women. What was the name of that man? Frederick Douglass, the great former slave orator. So in the year 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, as I said, in New York. 300 conferees were in attendance. It was at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, 2 days in July. Men were invited, but they were only allowed to attend the second day. At Seneca Falls, they considered 11 resolutions. The first 10 were things like this. Women could not at the time, under many circumstances in many states, own land, legally divorce, inherit property. Interestingly, custody was an issue. Today, in courts, almost by default, custody automatically goes to the mother. But back then, it was the opposite. It automatically went to the man. In fact, if there was such a situation, or if the husband was dead, oftentimes the custody would be transferred to the brother of the husband or the brother of the wife. So the ability to practice law, go to college, medicine, all these things were the first 10 resolutions. The final and 11th resolution was the most famous one, the right to vote. So the first 10 resolutions pass unanimously. However, when they get to the 11th, there's a little bit of a rift. Some of the mothers of the movement who were in attendance were worried that it would alienate too many men, it would alienate preachers, it would alienate Southerners, conservatives. People weren't quite ready for women to have the right to vote. So there was a discussion that maybe they should table the 11th resolution and just end the convention with the first 10. Stanton calls for a recess, and she and Frederick Douglass go outside and talk about it. They decide, no, let's go with the 11th. They went in and both of them gave speeches, and one can only imagine Frederick Douglass's charismatic words. He was, Martin Luther King of the 19th century, one might say. They give fantastic speeches. They call for the resolution, and it passes. So that was the Seneca Falls Convention. In the intervening years, of course, you have the Civil War, which disrupts things in 1861 to 1865. So the push to get women the right to vote and all these other rights is temporarily set aside. Now, the glue that kind of binds all the mothers of the movement together was that they were all abolitionists. They were in the trenches fighting to end slavery. So they continue their fight during the war. They also support Abraham Lincoln during the war, even though Lincoln was very unpopular at the time. The other thing that the mothers of the movement did to earn their stripes in the war was they fought as nurses. Some served, of course, as spies. Some covertly dressed as men and were in uniform. They lobbied, they advocated, but many of them served as nurses. Now, the kicker is this: it's not like we had a lot of colleges of nursing, and they weren't trained nurses. Imagine a Civil War era field hospital. We lose 600,000 men during the war. The casualty counts in the battles are astronomical. 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 plus thousand casualties per battle in some of the major conflicts of the war. With the primitive state of medicine at the time, a doctor would have a table, and they'd be bringing in a soldier. If you were shot in the arm or leg, if it shattered a bone or something, the potential of gangrene, there was no saving the limb. They would just amputate. Somebody would bite down on a leather strap. The nurses would hold them down, take a shot of some hard alcohol, amputate. There were descriptions of piles of limbs beside each one of the tents and field hospitals. So the conditions must have been unimaginably brutal and bloody for these nurses, and that's where the women served during the war. Toward the end of the war, they undertake another effort, and that's orphanages. Imagine the number of children that were orphaned because of this war. So they organize. Heck, even foster care today is inadequate and dang near reprehensible. We need to reform the entire system. But they organized adoptions, orphanages. So the mothers of the women's movement were active throughout that. The other great contribution was supporting Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction. So as the war ends in '65, Lincoln, rather than argue for retribution or payments from the South, Lincoln's policy was one of magnanimity, forgiveness. Let's bring the South into the fold. You don't want to win the war only to lose the peace. Lincoln, in his second inaugural, had the great line where he would say that, both sides drew the sword. Both sides prayed to the same God and evoked his mercy to help their cause. So Lincoln let the South down easy. We need to remember that the South shredded the Constitution. They ended the United States. They started the war. They drew first blood. And it was a war fought in good part to perpetuate human bondage. Remember, they were willing to send their sons to fight and die to retain slavery. And during the war, the conduct of the South was unforgivable at times. They tried to end prisoner exchanges. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863, and then put black soldiers in uniform, the South said they would stop prisoner exchanges. They even stopped quartering prisoners. They stopped accepting prisoners, threatened to kill every man, woman, child, black, white, in cold blood if the Union put blacks in uniform. And in fact, they made good on the threat. General Nathan Bedford Forrest, at the infamous Fort Pillow massacre, when a small group of black soldiers and a few white officers were overrun by the Confederacy, he put everyone to the sword rather than accepting a surrender. Forrest, by the way, would go on after the war to be one of the co-founders and first Grand Wizard of the KKK. So despite all this behavior, Lincoln wanted Reconstruction. Reconstruction would be forgiveness. They would rebuild the South. They would provide funding, end the practices of open lynching, and so forth and so on. A good measure of the policy of Reconstruction was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, all this, Lincoln was the architect. 1865, that would end slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, was equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 was Negro male suffrage. In other words, black men got the right to vote. Now, these were highly controversial, but while Lincoln was putting them together, by the way, with Frederick Douglass, it was the women of the mothers of the women's movement who were fighting for these efforts. The 13th passed. That would be the only one Lincoln would live to see. The 14th passed. When they get to the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote, here's a controversy. Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt that maybe they should not support this unless if it was not only black men, but also women getting the right to vote. So there was a split in the movement. Stanton worried that if we don't push for this now, when would we ever get it? Others said, look, we have been abolitionists. This is something we fought for years. We have to support it. In the end analysis, they bit the bullet and they said, okay, it's the right thing to do. We'll support it even though women don't get the right to vote. And interestingly, it would be another half a century, 50 years, before the 19th Amendment would be passed. So Stanton was onto something. The other thing that they fought for at the end of that was temperance. Now, too often textbooks dismiss temperance as teetotaling women, with big hats telling men not to drink. But there was something much deeper and much more profound to that. The women of the mothers of the women's movement fought against alcohol for the following reasons. Alcohol was the root of the rampant scourge of rape, domestic violence, and all this that was happening at the time. Think about it. It wasn't really until the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, before we had court cases to deal with things like this, before we even developed a vocabulary. The term acquaintance rape is a relatively new term. Domestic violence, spousal abuse, these are all new concepts. A man was king of his house, and if he raped or beat his wife, it was his prerogative. There just wasn't a legal code or system to enforce it. Rape, even today, so few cases are successfully prosecuted. Imagine back then. So alcohol was an epidemic because it caused so much violence in society. I've written a number of books set in the 1700s and 1800s, and it's kind of an informal rule of mine after reading countless military reports, diaries, letters, newspapers from those 2 centuries. I've read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. I estimate that 1 out of every 3 men at the time was a full-blown alcoholic. So it was the root of a lot of violence. So these are some of the things that the women's movement pushed for. In the years then after the war, starting from 1869 up through the 1880s, there was a split in the movement. There was the National Women's Suffrage Association headed by Susan B. Anthony, and then on the other hand, the American Women's Suffrage Association headed by Lucy Stone. And the split was over an important issue which still remains controversial, and that was basically family planning and birth control. Susan B. Anthony was not in favor of it, so her National Women's Suffrage Association would be, I guess you could say, the more conservative of the two, whereas Lucy Stone and the American Women's Suffrage favored family planning, as did Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So the concern among the original mothers of the movement was, if women are constantly pregnant, it was not uncommon for someone to have multiple miscarriages, multiple stillborn. The infant mortality rates were atrocious, and a lot of children. So if someone has 3 or 4 kids and is pregnant, how do you get a job? How do you pursue equality? How do you get active in politics? So family planning was at the root, the basis, foundation for women to get active in politics. So there was a big rift in the movement there. The other interesting advent was Carrie Chapman Catt, C-A-T-T. I'm a fan of Carrie Chapman Catt's. She takes over in the 1880s and 1890s, and she's really the one that gets this moving. Carrie Chapman Catt adopts some new policies. One of them was really creative. On one hand, she focuses on younger women. Maybe the time has passed for older women. Maybe we can't change minds and hearts. But with younger women, we can train them and from early on, and it's then if we get young women on board, it's only a matter of time. It's not if, but when we get the right to vote. She also had young women talk to newspapers, and Americans then read these articulate, smart, and informed comments from young women and thought, gee, women are intelligent, hello. So she promoted a number of new policy issues. They did speaking tours, but here's the main thing. Carrie Chapman Catt, instead of trying to get a nationwide constitutional amendment, she said, let's start and go state by state. After all, we're going to need the states. Remember, to amend the Constitution, you need 2/3 of the House and Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. So she said, let's go state by state by state. That makes sense. This is a smart approach. And then she says, the states we're going to look at are these absolutely wild, wild west, rural places like Montana, Idaho, territories like Wyoming. that doesn't make sense, it would seem. Seems counterintuitive. You should start with New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey, your more progressive states that you think would do this. But here's her point. What she realized was those Western states and those remote Western territories, there were no women. There would be one woman for every thousands and thousands and thousands of men. So the men were desperate. They were willing to do darn near anything to get women. So she makes a deal. If you support a woman's right to vote, I will get women to come out to your state. So what happened was the territory of Wyoming, followed by states like Colorado and Utah and Idaho, these states where there were straight out of a Clint Eastwood Western movie kind of a scene. All these states start passing a woman's right to vote because they were so desperate to get women to come out there. Then Kat makes the deal. She says, oh, by the way, in addition to getting the right to vote, we need the right to inherit property, own land, divorce, custody rights, practice the law, get a business license, all the first 10 resolutions from Seneca Falls, and the states were so desperate they came on board. Now, she simply went then to women back east, and a lot of young women wanted to run their own business and pursue careers, but of course it's difficult for a woman to do so because of the grotesque sexism of the late 1800s. So she says, look, if you go out west, there's no competition. They'll give you a business license. You're set. So everybody was happy, and Carrie Chapman Catt really pushed that, and states started to come on board. The next key moment was the election in 1912 of Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson runs in 1912, and there was a lot of optimism because Wilson was a progressive who wanted to complete the legacy of the great Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1909. And Teddy Roosevelt pushed child labor laws. He pushed conservation. Remember, he's the great conservationist. A lot of our national parks, wildlife refuges, and so forth, all from TR. Teddy Roosevelt pushed meat inspections and regulations on food processing, just a host of issues. First American to win a Nobel Prize. He negotiated in the early 1900s the end of the Russo-Japanese conflict. So Teddy Roosevelt had been a progressive who pursued all these agendas and got them passed. There were two things Teddy Roosevelt favored, however, that he did not get passed. One was universal health care. Of course, we're still waiting for that. Secondly, was a woman's right to vote. But Teddy Roosevelt at least, inbounds the ball and got the conversation going. So Woodrow Wilson, a former university professor and president of Princeton University, he's running on this progressive ticket. So women celebrated. The women's movement said, if Wilson gets elected, that's it. Sure enough, Wilson got elected. Now, the inauguration date today is January 20th at noon. Back then, it was March 4th. So on March 4th, 1913, Wilson's going to be inaugurated. So the day before, there were massive rallies, massive parades. Women from all across the country came and had these great parades. And this excitement was in the air. We're going to get the right to vote. Unfortunately, Wilson then comes into office and flip-flops. And he doesn't support any longer a woman's right to vote. So it's devastating for the movement. Something happens, however. Woodrow Wilson's wife, Ellen Axon, dies in office, and Wilson is devastated. He's also racked with guilt. You see, he was having an affair at the time of his wife's death with a woman named Clara Peck, a wealthy woman who had taken him to her retreat in Bermuda. Those in the know called Wilson Mrs. Peck's bad boy. So he's racked with guilt. So Wilson starts looking at what can he do to support a woman's agenda. Wilson has 3 daughters. He's trying to be pro-woman. But something else intervenes. While he's trying to promote a woman's agenda, he meets a wealthy widow by the name of Edith Bowling Galt, G-A-L-T. Her husband was a jeweler who left her with a lot of money. And Edith Bowling Galt is really something. First off, she's scandalous. Today she'd be a Kardashian and have her own reality TV show. Newspapers would write about her scandals. Would you like to hear her scandals? This is how scandalous she was. Are you ready? Let me make sure nobody else is listening. She drove her own car. I'm serious. I'm not making that up. Here's the other one. She went to parties unescorted. So she's quite something. She's also headstrong, loves politics. Wilson meets her, and she rocks his world. They start courting aggressively, and the press follows them around on their dates. They record that she's seen leaving the White House early in the morning. In fact, there was a joke in Washington at the time. They said that when World War I started, Edith was so shocked she fell out of the president's bed. Wilson and Edith would go out in a carriage or go out for picnics and carriage rides, and the press would follow them around. One of the greatest typos in history occurred at this time. The media was writing that the president was again seen entertaining Miss Galt, but they misspelled it, and the typo said the president was again seen entering Miss Galt. So it was a huge controversy. Gotta love it. At any rate, Edith tells Woodrow, listen, you better support a woman's right to vote. So Wilson moves forward with it, changes his mind, and supports a woman's right to vote. In 1918, it's introduced. It's going through the House. It's going through the Senate. It almost passes in 1918. It's 2 votes shy. But Alice Paul and the mothers of the movement, they say, let's not wait several years. Let's move right away while Edith is the first lady. Yeah, the 2 of them got married, I failed to say. In fact, there's a proper period of courting before you remarry when you lose a spouse. But Wilson moved with lightning speed, as fast as the Boca Brisket Brigade down here in Boca Raton, Florida. And that's fast. So at any rate, they got married, and Edith is first lady. So the women's movement wants to push the resolution again to amend the Constitution while she's in office. So in 1920, they do it again. And they organize all around the country and promote this, and there's massive rallies. They're making great progress. And what happens in 1920 is it passes the House, it passes the Senate. This thing is moving forward. It looks like it's going to work. Now, it passes the House and Senate, but you need 3/4 of the states. So what happens when it passes the House and Senate, Southerners, Republicans, Christians, conservatives, they dig in and they form anti-women's suffrage movements. And there's a battle now around the country. Some states, those states in the West, where there weren't many women, they all ratified. The northeastern, more progressive liberal states ratified, of course, all of Dixie. The more conservative states in the South are against it. They vote against it. And it comes down, they have 35 states had passed this. They need 36 to amend the Constitution. A handful of states, however, were holding off on the vote for a variety of reasons. Here's your surprise. One of them was Florida. Yeah, so we didn't move on it. So there's 1 state remaining, and they're 1 state shy. That state was Tennessee. So the women's movement is devastated because Tennessee is a conservative southern state. It's not going to pass it. So the women's movement descends on Tennessee. Christians, conservatives, Southerners, Republicans descend to oppose it. It's a battleground. They finally have the vote in Tennessee, and it's a tie. 48-48. You can't script anything better. So it's a tie, but they find out that one of the representatives, the man who was the youngest representative in the state legislature, Harry T. Byrne, B-U-R-N, he's only 24, he wasn't there. It seems that he was homesick. So everybody rushes to find Harry T. Byrne, and they're lobbying him on how to vote. Now here's the problem for the women's movement. Byrne represented a very, very conservative district, and he was a Republican. So Southerners, conservatives, Republicans were ready to celebrate. They knew they were going to win by 1 vote and deny this. However, Harry T. Byrne had a mother. Her name was Febb Byrne, F-E-B-B, and she was getting him dressed and getting him some soup, making sure he feels better, and he has to go and cast his vote. So Harry goes to cast his vote, and his mother gave him a note, put it in his pocket. Harry takes out the note. Now, here's the backstory for the note. The opponents to a woman's right to vote, Republicans, they were calling Mrs. Cat Mrs. Rat. I know it seems highly unusual that a Republican would call people names and bully folks, but imagine that. So they're calling her Mrs. Rat, and they're saying they smell a rat in ratification. So Harry T. Byrne goes to cast his famous vote, pulls his note out of his pocket. It's a note from his mother. "Dear son," she says, "don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." And it passed by one vote. So in closing, a man, a mother, and a good boy. It was Thomas Mann, a Republican from Illinois, that introduced the resolution to amend the Constitution for women getting the right to vote. And it was a brilliant move by the supporters of this to get a Republican to do this, because we need to realize this transcends party differences. This enables, empowers, and franchises women all across, millions of women all across this country. The mother was Feb Byrne. By the way, after this, Feb Byrne is attacked by Southerners and Republicans and saying that she needs to recant. Feb never recanted. And then Harry is even accused of taking bribes. They attacked him and went after him. He's even investigated. They call for an investigation, but he's exonerated. At his next election, they tried to get him defeated, but he won by a narrow amount. So that's the man, the mother, and the good boy. I'm happy to say Harry Byrne went on to a long and successful career as an attorney and in politics, and always advocated rights for women because he was a good boy who remembered his mother. So 2 morals from our story today. 1, always listen to your mother. And number 2, every vote counts. In this case, 1 vote empowered millions of women all across the country after 80 years since the initial in 1840, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to go to Europe to help end slavery. Thank you.